Welcome to the Building Culture podcast. I'm Austin Tennell, and today I've got a friend and colleague, Thomas Dougherty, on. And actually, Tom came on as the lead urban designer in Building Culture a few months ago. And actually, we recorded this podcast back in November 2023, and it got lost. So I'm just now publishing. So there might be some out-of-date information there if we were talking about anything about building culture. But it's a great conversation. Tom has a background actually growing up on a farm and has Oklahoma roots and lived up on a regenerative farm in Ohio. And his parents actually are quite well-known regenerative farmers, and actually know Joe Saladin over at Polyface Farm quite well for anyone that kind of lives in that world and knows about food and food systems. But today, we get to have about an hour conversation, and we talk about the centralization of capital in real estate and how that affects decision making, and how we prioritize profits over people, and what we're trying to do differently. We're trying to solve these things, not just talk and complain about them. Smaller scale development and the creation of smaller grained places, are really essential for vibrant communities. That our current infrastructure and the way we think about infrastructure is really unsustainable financially. And if you look at whether it's strong towns or urban 3, we're in serious financial trouble with the way that we build, but we just haven't quite experienced it yet. But we think we really will start experiencing that over the next 20, 30, 40 years. We talk about how, given the environment that we live in, how do you do anything? And so we talk about infill development and how we approach and think about our projects and infill development, local investment, and kind of rethinking the way we raise capital. And lastly, talking about just recognize the potential for infill development and building streets as public spaces can really create beautiful, wonderful places. And this idea that humans can be an enriching, we tend to think of human beings and people and developers as destructive forces, because in so many ways we are destructive and extractive. But also some of the greatest cities and towns and neighborhoods in the world, or even forests that have been maintained, and the trees have grown beautiful and big, and you can gallop through the woods. Humans can actually cultivate. And that's really where Tom and I align here on values. It's about people, and we actually think people are capable of immense good and immense beauty. So hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the Building Culture podcast. I'm your host, Austin Tennell, and today I've got a friend and colleague on, Thomas Dougherty, who actually works part-time for Building Culture, but is in Westchester, just outside of Philadelphia. Tom, could you kind of say hi and just give a little bit of an intro in your background?
Thanks, Austin. Happy to be here. So we tried doing this recording, 2 weeks ago. And at that time, you were like, hey, don't actually talk too much about your background, so I won't do it this time. Studied architecture and urban design at Notre Dame, and focused on interblock development, so allowing developers and incremental developers to create new space inside the block. That's what I'm focused on.
I'm excited. You're also known as the alley guy, I feel like, right, in small circles.
Yep.
Yeah, talk actually a little about that. How did you become known as the alley guy? That's actually an interesting progression.
Okay. So we're going to talk about human scale, I think, at some point. So that's a key aspect of it. I was in grad school, and I think when I first went to grad school, I was looking at both architecture programs, with the urban design concentration like Notre Dame, but I was actually also looking at city planning programs. So I was torn actually between the Berkeley program and the Notre Dame program, and I ended up going Notre Dame program, and I'm really grateful for that. And I think when you see the issues around, like everybody's car dependent, like all the strong town stuff, I think very often when you first get into reading Kunstler or reading Andreas or reading, whoever you're reading, you want to go fix transportation or build new cities or whatever it's going to be. And so I kind of went in there with that in mind. I was reading stuff about like bus rapid transit, which is probably funny for you to hear because like what I'm working on now. But I was looking at like the macro issues of like isolation and like all the other aspects of our built environment. On the back of your shirt is we shape our buildings thereafter they shape us, and like obviously cities similarly. So I was looking at the macro aspects of that. Well, my time in school, I slowly was focusing more and more on what an architect or an urban designer can actually control. And I think the main piece of that was like a scale reference. When I was in Europe, when I was looking at the places that are inspiring us, they're not, it's apples to oranges to the cities and towns we have today. And so if you look at, your favorite space or sequence of spaces, or like downtown Florence or Siena or whatever, and you compare that to, wherever you're going to go live, like Westchester, where I am, and I use the example all the time, the imperial city of Rome fits inside of what people call my small town of Westchester. And so I think of the lifetime's worth of work.
And how many people live in Westchester, for an example, like so people know? Because I don't know either. Isn't it like 30,000 or something?
It's actually super dense. It's 22 or
22,000 people in
like
a square. And then how big is it? So the
mile and a half.
Can you say it again? Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the imperial city of Rome fits in a city of 22,000 people is what you're saying?
More, I would say, like, because if you go to most cities or towns that are a mile and a half by a mile and a half in the United States, they're going to like have 2,000 people. So it's not really.
I see. Yeah, you've got a lot of population density for the size.
We actually are one of the densest municipalities in the country.
Right.
Westchester is, for a small town.
And then you're just referencing the scale to imperial Rome,
I guess, and I'm like getting sidetracked here. But I was focusing more and more on scale. And I remember, I spent a semester in Gaming, Austria, so like nestled in the Alps as an undergraduate. Mm-hmm. It's like this small town, and we were in a Carthusian monastery from the 12th century, and it was an amazing immersion into like human scale places, walkability, beauty, durability. Like, we were in these cloisters and courtyards and things that were 800 years old. So that was pretty incredible. And then when we studied abroad at Notre Dame in Rome for a semester, and I remember a professor there who always had us measuring street widths. So we'd be walking down the street and be like, okay, what's the width here? What's the width here? And when we got back to the States, I realized that a wide street in Rome is closer to an alley width in the United States. And so when I'm trying to create that sense of scale, sense of place, those are the right of ways I can play with. Like, unless you're going to do greenfield development, you can't get to this kind of human scale. And if you have to make room for, all the parking and the deliveries and the fire trucks and everything else, you're also not going to be able to get at that scale. Okay, so that's one piece of it. I'm still answering the alley question. The other piece was I was really interested in the small developer, incremental developer, and I was watching the ADU movement on the West Coast. And I've been watching it for a few years at that point. And there's some really interesting aspects to that. And I think the most important one is actually you're empowering homeowners to make more of their lot, and you're enabling multi-generational living. But as I was thinking about, okay, so ADUs are happening on the West Coast. They don't have interblock alleys like service streets.
And by the way, ADUs are kind of like garage apartments in some ways. It can also come in different forms than that, but I think that's probably the simplest one for people to understand. Would you say, or where you are,
absolutely,
is an ADU even part of the house?
That's exactly what I'm thinking about. Like when I was fascinated by them, it was as a a little guest apartment out the back.
Right. And what most people don't know that might be listening is that ADUs or garage apartments are illegal to build in the vast majority of our cities in the United States.
That's right. Current zoning just doesn't have a use category for making income on your property. So that's why Airbnb is illegal almost everywhere, and that's because the zoning is very specific about the uses you can have, and if you're in like a generic residential district, those uses don't include short-term.
And it's not just uses; it's really like dwelling. R1 zoning is just like there can be one dwelling unit. Period. There's nothing else. Doesn't matter. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. Well, that
I just want to
actually
make sure people
is
listening
what
understand, because I can't believe, there's ADU that's a very technical term,
Yep.
people don't actually know it unless you're in the industry.
Well, and I think that technical term is why it slips through. It's absolutely a loophole, right? It's
Yeah.
saying like this is the secondary dwelling unit that can kind of slide underneath the radar because it's going to be accessory to the primary. So like, let's picture you had a lot. You can't just go build an ADU, right? You
Right.
have to have a primary home for the secondary dwelling unit to be, secondary to that primary home. So whatever.
Right.
But I was watching that and I was thinking about ADUs moving east. And we have alleys. The Midwest has alleys. Like anything
We have
developed
alleys here in
between
Oklahoma City.
anywhere between about 1800 and about 1920 is going to have alleys. And so I remember John Gell did a study in, I think, Seattle. And one of the things he pointed to was the alley network of the downtown district. And he was saying this land would double the public realm of, I forget what it was. Maybe it was like, it's as much as like all the parks and whatever. But if you imagine the number of alleys in your town,
Yeah.
it's a huge amount of land. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about this human scale and realizing that, hey, as Oklahoma City or these others start to legalize ADUs, there's this moment where we could think about the alley as more than a service street for picking up trash. We could imagine it as a residential street at a human scale. And the model for that was in Philadelphia, that's my experience when I was timber framing in Philadelphia. I was walking around those there, and that was very much developed by incremental small developers. It wasn't planned by the city. They were just creating 18-foot, 20-foot wide streets running down the center of, platted blocks. So that's the alley thing. I wrote. I worked. I was at it. I was offered a year of independent research at Notre Dame in 2019, 2018, 2019. And so that's what I focused on. And a couple years ago, I could kind of compile a bunch of stuff and put together a 4-part article series that Strong Towns turned into an ebook. So it's called The American Alley Hidden Resource. That's the alley
Very
guy.
cool. I didn't actually know. That was cool to hear myself. Actually, I hadn't realized the Rome, your experience there. And then I like that correlation too of making the connection of, wait, the big street there is the little street here, but even recognize it and say, imagine what alleys could be. And it's interesting, I was so shaped by after college, and I was going into accounting, for anyone that doesn't know that, before I got into all this. But I had a 3-month gap before my job started, and I just made a bunch of money. Well, I say a bunch of money for that age, an apprenticeship, not an apprenticeship, sorry, an internship at the accounting firm. And so I had 3 months, and it was like, I'm just going to go travel. So I backpacked by myself for 3 months and just spent time in Spain and Portugal. And I'd been to Italy a couple times, like for like a week or something at a time in college. But it was really those several months spent in Spain. And I'm still new. Like, I don't understand. I don't really know what suburban sprawl means, yet, or something like that. I certainly don't know what new urbanism is. And it's hard, like, the older I get, because that's quite a long time ago, 2011, but like how much that experience shaped me, because I suddenly, I didn't understand what it was, but it was this experience of walking and experiencing beauty and being drawn to things. And I was walking around like with wonder a lot. Now, granted, I know that if you live there, you talk to people that live in beautiful places, and it's not like they're just gaping up at the cathedral or something all day long. But being surrounded by and sustained by beauty and having the freedom of mobility, not like people think, and I'm suburbs of Houston, right? So quintessential suburban sprawl city. And, people are, the car is the ultimate freedom. And I understand that idea, because when you're talking about, I can just get in my car and go wherever I want. And if you're talking about traveling long distances and stuff, it's just, the car is an unbelievably amazing technology and so useful in so many ways. But the way we build, it actually becomes more of a hindrance and kind of like more like slavery than it is freedom, in terms of how we use automobiles here in our subdivisions. And I don't know, it was just so eye-opening to me to experience that beauty, that scale, that really came back around too when frankly, when I met you in 2016 and you really just talking about human scale is where I started to make more connections. I mean, I was reading Christopher Alexander at that point and other things, but yeah, it really takes experiencing something else, I think, to otherwise you just don't have the context to imagine something.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When you experience, yeah, that's neat. I didn't realize you were backpacking around for 3 months until you told me 2 weeks ago when we
Yeah.
were chatting about this. But it made more like your passion and what you're doing makes more sense now that I know that. For me, it's in part like being an undergraduate and living in this monastery in the
Right.
Alps, and wandering around these German cities at age 18,
Yeah.
19, whatever I was, and it's world changing. Anne Sussman, who's that?
Yeah. We need to have her on this
She's like
podcast.
she's the like the psychologist who's doing like the brain mapping, and she's making the arguments for the human condition and its relationship to the built environment, and like the theories such as like thigmotaxis, like we're a wall hugging species. Well, so are other animals too, but like we do hug walls. It's just it's one of the things that we do. And so explaining aspects of the built environment, she talks about going to France or something as in college, and feeling more at home there than she'd ever felt at home, or in the United States. And I think that that's a very common experience. I have a feeling that you had aspects of that. Definitely, I was feeling that. I felt myself. I sensed myself being reflected in the scale, in the beauty, and in large part, we talk about human scale, and I think human scale, almost most importantly, is tied to, or as importantly as anything else, is tied to durability, and how do we measure the person? In part, is the person's relationship to generations, right? It's like childhood through old age, the fact that somebody's ushering you into life and out of life. And so those buildings and cities and towns that have more of a context, like historical context, are in some sense reflecting the human scale in a way that, our type 5 construction on top of a podium for parking, that's going to be, class A, class B, class C apartments real quick, and then not worth inheriting, not worth selling in like 40 years, is clearly not reflecting the values of the person.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And well, actually, it kind of comes back to how our architecture really is just a reflection of our values. It really is I guess you could say, like a manifestation of values, whether we realize it consciously or not. It's not like people are going around being like, I value this, therefore I'm going to build like this. Although some people do. If you're building a house, right, you might value a large living room, whatever it is, because you like entertaining. But coming back to the experience of the human experience, I grew up in the suburbs of Houston. I remember the neighborhood I lived in was, suburban subdivision. It wasn't like a super nice neighborhood, but it wasn't dumpy either. It was an enjoyable suburb. You could say there were some trees, some actually mature trees. And there's almost a little bit of like, that was the vision of the suburbs in some sense.
Yep.
Because when I was growing up in Houston, it really was that. And then we could ride our bikes for, I was 12 years old, and we were riding our bikes for 10 miles out down bayous into things. We'd go to stores, right? We'd find a Starbucks. I can't remember what stores we were going to that age, but you know what I mean? We'd be out in the nature. We'd play paintball. We'd go camping like nearby. And we were like, my dad worked in the city in Houston, but he did have to, by the way, drive, generally speaking, about a 45-minute commute to work. And on the way home, it could often be an hour to an hour and a half, and that's normal in Houston. And that was back then. That now, I mean, there's so many people, it's normal to have 1 to 2 hour commutes in these cities. But what's interesting is as I was leaving high school, there was so much development going around Houston, but it hadn't fully quite affected me. By the time I came back, like during college, there was nothing left. there was no land left. There was
Yep.
no nature left. There were no or there were parks, but they were like, leftover parks and subdivisions that no one could access and you wouldn't want to use anyway because they were like just lined by a fence and two houses on the side or something. And that's where I like starting to really, I was piecing that together recently. Like suburbia does not scale well. Like the idea of it can sound really nice, and when you just have some of it, it can be okay because at least you have the positives of the privacy and the quote unquote convenience of your house that you go to. But as everything around it gets, as more, actually, and Anthony said this the other day, the more people come to suburbia, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
Versus, largely speaking, not always, but the opposite happens with urbanism. The more people come, the more kind of like vibrant and lively it gets. And I'd say that with suburbia, and just that you don't have any traffic gets worse. You might have a few more services, but it's just all a very unpleasant experience at some point. You can't walk to school, you can't walk to parks, you can't walk to the coffee shop, you can't do anything without getting in your car. And if you're a kid, I mean, you're good luck. You're not going to do anything.
Right. I think that's a really interesting observation. Like the more people that come to suburbia, kind of the worse it gets. And I think one of the things is there's suburbia and then there's suburbia. I was actually just today. So I'm in this little, mile and a half by mile and a half town that's like really dense and walkable. And actually, some of our town developed in the 60s. And so we have the kind of, and so here's suburbia, right? Like we have some of that kind of cul-de-sac stuff in our town with little 1,000 square foot homes or 1,200 square foot homes. Like, like the size, like just to get a scale reference, like what kind of homes were being developed in the 50s and 60s, right? They were not the kind of homes we're seeing being developed today on the amount of land. And so it's actually pretty tight neighborhoods on small lots with small homes. And so I was just outside of our town surveying a 1952 home today and was struck by how pleasant the 1950s suburbs can be, especially in the Philadelphia area and the earlier ones too. Like there were like 20s and 30s era kind of like, suburb
right
towns. And in between like where I am in Philadelphia that are like actually really beautiful.
Right. Well, I remember when you visited Oklahoma City, I don't know, because we bought here our house in 2020, at very end of 2019. And when you came, I think in 2020 or 2021, you're like, man, this is beautiful. Like, this is great. Like this neighborhood. And I would say it is great. I mean, the lots are about 50 feet wide by 140. They're 7,000 square foot lots. A lot of them are actually single story. And we're only a couple miles from downtown. But it's got old trees. But I would say the biggest key is, well, one of the biggest things I should say is detached garages off the back of the house. So there's houses are next to each other. There's a driveway in between. These houses are only like probably 12 feet apart or so. But you've got a lot of space in the front yard. You got the full front yard, the full backyard kind of thing, but the house is about 12 feet from each other, and you drive down your driveway and go into the back garage. And boy, the difference that makes for how the neighborhood can look and feel, and without losing any convenience, in my opinion. Like I've never had the thought, well, by the way, I mean, my office technically is my garage, but I walk out here every day the same. So it's like, why, I wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, I've got to walk out of my house and back to the garage if I'm going to the car, as in, it's just, I don't know. I actually have a lot of interest in figuring out how to build suburbs well in the right context too. Not just build, because that's the thing. Context matters, and where you're building matters. And not everything should be dense urbanism, right? Not everything is inner city or something. And what is that suburban? How could we just make it like better? I don't know. And even I actually want to brainstorm this with you, Tom. This is something I've been thinking about. Like, I would like to brainstorm with Tom.
I'm going to jump in here for the listeners that don't know what we're working on and stuff like that. To say like we're kind of like, oh, suburbs, like, because we've been reading things and obviously talking with people. We're part of like, a community that's bashed the suburbs for so long that we can say like, oh, there's some suburbs that aren't so terrible. But it's not like, I don't think that either one of us is really itching to go build in that manner. And if
not in that manner, but I mean, like, what I'm talking about by suburbs is I'm even talking about like the project we were looking at with these kind of like Charleston side houses, but with land. You know what I mean? Where I just mean, because and here's what I mean by this is, everyone, like the moment, and this is actually something I want to brainstorm like next, is like, what is maybe some different terminology we could be using, and even in the movements, whether it's new urbanism and stuff like that, because when you just say urban and suburb, and I get that is, I get that it's so confusing for people, because if you start critiquing suburbia, most people would just go, well, I don't want to be on top of each other, all living in giant apartment buildings and condos and blah, blah, blah. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not talking about suddenly just making everything attached housing or something. There's something wrong with having detached single family houses. It's more scale and quantity, you could say, and context and what's around it. Because when I say like Carlton Landing is a great example, complete suburb. You could put that near Oklahoma City, where, it's drivable too, and you still have all sorts of services and school. You've got a school, you've got coffee shop, you've got a beer spot, you've got food, you've got businesses around there. And then, yeah, you might have to drive out to go to work, but boy, what a richer experience. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So maybe just for my sake and for everybody else's sake, like define what you mean by suburb, because you just said Carlton Landing is a suburb.
Oh,
so
yeah, thank you.
What are we talking about?
Just something that is not hyper urban.
Okay, so I think what we should do at some point is sit down and look at so I would argue that one framework, and the best framework to go back to when we're trying to think about this, is settlement types. And so you can find a hamlet in England, you can find a hamlet in Russia, you can find a hamlet in China. And so there are some certain characteristics of, let's say, like, what is a hamlet, and maybe that's the least dense or the smallest collection of individuals living on an agrarian economy. I mean, like, hardly economy, but like, it's agrarian, right? It's not hunter-gatherers, but it's a hamlet. So it's a collection of small group people. There's security involved. It's probably relatively tight in the inner block, or the space between whatever the structures are. And that's probably largely because you're ushering in animals in there at night or in times of danger. But there's an aspect of, like, you might even say village, like it might feel like a village, right? And so then, like, if you're talking about settlement types, like, and this is just like historians have helped put these together, architects of it. The Germans were fascinated by this. I'm going to blank on all the names, but Douglas Duany would always bring this up, right? Like, there are the books, like, all in German. They're all talking about the settlement types and how you can, like, you find this through archaeology. But, like, okay, well, next let's maybe talk about village. And I think that's probably the ideal for most American families. And I saw Create Streets put out an image on Twitter, something a day or two ago. And it was like the quintessential, like, village square with the houses around it. And there's the school and the church or whatever else. And it's like, this is what people are asking for.
Right.
And when you talked about, like, suburb or like urban and whatever, I think in terms of, like, these settlement types. So, like, village, and in some sense, is it urban? I would say it's more urban than almost anything. It's more urban than downtown Oklahoma City. I would say it's more urban than downtown Oklahoma City because it's spatial.
Mm-hmm.
And
right, it's defined spaces,
identifiable in that, like, you have it's an outdoor room defined by buildings and walls and trees. So, like, if I'm in the town square of the village, I know that I'm in the town square of the village, as opposed to, like, I'm on a street in downtown. I'm kind of harping on Oklahoma City, not for any good reason, could be anywhere, but, like, I'm on the middle of a street in downtown Oklahoma City, and maybe there's a building to my left on one side of the street, and maybe it's just like parking lot for, like, a whole half block on the other side. So somebody might say, well, you're on a 60 something foot wide street. And I would say, I don't care about the street bed, like the cartway. I'm measuring the distance between identifiable edges, right?
Building to building.
Yeah. Building to building, or building to tree, or building to wall, or building to
garden
fence,
wall, yeah.
Something that's intentionally creating a sense of space. So village, I think, is kind of the ideal that most people have and are looking for. And so, yeah, that's probably part of the pushback when people think about urban or suburban. But suburban is not village. And then, like, if you're moving up in the settlement type, you usually get to, like, market town. Well, what's the difference between village and market town? Well, historically, that's largely that market towns, like, to have, like, so in England, for example, you were given, like, market rights. Like, the king would say, like, you, village, I will protect a market to be held every Saturday, whatever. And then all of a sudden the economy was big enough that it could expand more.
Right.
And so like a village, like if you go to the
It's more
Netherlands, you
commerce.
see like village, 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 village. You can bike, like you just start biking and like every like few minutes, there's another village. Well, part of
Right.
that is that like back in the day, obviously you were limited to whatever farming you could do adjacent. And
Right.
so to us, after a certain level, it makes more sense to like, okay, we're going to start the next village as opposed to spreading the farms out and then having to bring the produce in closer. And so you have like, I mean, that's one of the reasons, but you have all these small villages. Well, as soon as you have a town market, the economy is different and it can do different things. So there are identifiable types to this, right? So like a market street, like that's something that we can I see in, again, in England. You can see that in Spain. You can see that in Russia. And so like these different settlement types have different like urban spatial character, like spaces that have certain characters. Like a market street is like a type of the market town. And then city is like, another step. So like back to England, like very often the cities, the politics were tied with religion. And so it was often called a cathedral city. So it's like a market town that was also the seat of some kind of religious power. And there was usually both, secular and religious power, but it was a cathedral city in that like it had the economic power to build that cathedral. So that's what I think of actually when I'm thinking about like the difference between them. And so very often, like maybe you're in the middle of nowhere. And so it seems very rural, like let's say at Carlton Landing, but maybe you have like a group of buildings and homes that are inward, that are adjacent to each other. There are values to proximity, and it might feel rural, but in some sense, inside of there might actually be more urban than Oklahoma City. I had a professor,
which is the way I feel like we need more like better language. Sure. Because I don't disagree. Like I actually no, I totally agree with you. Like that's kind of actually what I'm struggling with is like what is the, because something about, I know like subdivision for me means something kind of very, I don't know if this is actually like factually accurate, like in terms of you looked it up the definition, which I guess we could do, but for me subdivision kind of means two things. I think two. It means it's protected, quote unquote, as in it's disconnected is another way of saying that by protected, as in there's probably one or two entrances in, so if a developer buys a plot of land, they're going to develop that whole thing and they will probably have some grand entrance saying, Pine Creek Forest Estates, even though there's no pines or creeks or forest or anything, some, quote, kind of ugly or try to be pretty entrance. And then you enter this subdivision of all houses in a very, very, very narrow range, and those are the kind of the two things. It's disconnected, it's isolated, and it's monolithic housing, essentially, kind of like a monocrop, just a field of soy and corn, you're not doing regenerative agriculture or anything. Is that how you think about subdivisions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like I think about like the subdivision is a reflection of policy and finance, I think, right? Like nobody designed it. It's just a reflection of codes, zoning codes, and finance, which comes with timeframes, right? Like it's how do you take a chunk of land, divide it up effectively and efficiently to put it back out in the market. So in some sense, like I don't like engaging with it when like new urbanists talk about like we're going to fix the suburbs or like we're going to deal with the suburbs. It's like it's not even a type. It's like what happens if you spit in a bunch of parameters to like or what happens if you put parameters in Excel spreadsheet and like it spits out something like okay, so you have a form that's called the suburbs. Who cares? Right. Like it's not a reflection of, and if that's what suburb means, like the whole cul-de-sac and like the 1 acre sites and whatever, there's very little reflection of like the human condition there.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm not talking about fixing suburbs or something like that, but I'm still trying to figure out like language, and maybe I'm not providing enough context, but we're starting to talk a lot more at building culture and be louder about things and talking not just about building, but critiquing, there's so many people doing this, like whether strong towns or wherever you just were in, Ion or something. But when you go to talk about those things outside of the specialized circles, the language often doesn't work very well. And that's kind of what I mean is like, how do we I was just trying to think if you had any thoughts of other language to just be like urban, suburban, or is that just it? I don't know.
We should definitely brainstorm because language is so powerful and it's so important.
Right.
And
I can tell it's a barrier for people right now. Like when I'm talking and like people get hung up on something that I don't even mean, like they just assume I mean something because of the word that I use. And I could actually mean the exact opposite. And that's what they think, and you're like, whoa, that's not what I meant.
Right. I think one of the issues is that we don't have good precedent around us. And to the point you made earlier about Spain, like you have to be there to really understand it. So I would be hesitant to do much in the way of like trying to like wordsmith something, because if you don't have a reference point for it, like I don't try ever to like, or not anymore, to like convince people of anything when it comes to like this stuff. It's like, if you're not interested in like the beautiful villa or like the project Townsend that we're working on right now, like I think that there's a market that's going to die for these kinds of spaces, and there are some people who are not going to want those spaces, and trying to convince them of one or the other, like big policy. And I think that's part of the reasons why I'm more interested in smaller projects as opposed to like,
you can actually pull them off.
I was like, oh, first I was looking at like public transportation or whatever, and that I think the advocacy role has to be built up, like to the name of your company. Like it's a culture project.
See, that's what I was going to bring back. Like I think language is really important, and
sure.
Because what we are doing is building culture, and we're trying to create a collective vision.
Yeah.
And I think collective vision requires like some advocacy, and I don't mean that's our main thing, but I mean, and I don't think it's everyone's job. I just mean I'm kind of thinking about it from our perspective and what we deal with, because we're trying to actually get policy changes locally so that we can actually do better projects. And that does take getting people on board with an idea. I was in Michigan talking to a bunch of city councilors, like elected city officials throughout the state. And they came to this convention. I happened to be speaking at it. And the people that have been introduced to some of these ideas before, I mean, really, I think from what I can tell, and I don't know all the feedback, like I think a lot of those people really liked it, and got things from it. But the people that hadn't even heard some of the language I was using before, I think it was very off-putting and threatening even, because I kind of jumped really into kind of more advanced stuff you're saying. And so like, I'm trying to learn personally, how do I kind of, because just like building, like I've been doing this for 10 years. If I go to talk to someone that's never built anything before, even if I'm trying to talk to you don't know anything, I'm going to use words. I'm going to be like gable, the hip roof, the dormer. And you're going to go, what is a gable? What is a hip roof? What is a dormer? Do you mean, that's what I mean? Like actually being, I don't know. So just that's what I mean by it.
I hear you. And I think that's absolutely important. And as you know, I've been hitting my head up against the wall here in Westchester, part of our Harvard Commission. Finally, after years, got an ADU policy passed. And so I'm very aware of the need for dialogue. But I think more important, like advocacy work can be done by building good examples. And so like, like didn't Steve Jobs like famously like not bring in like outside people to like say like, what's your problem? He would say, he would build it and then show you, and then there's market adoption. And so I think very similarly, I'm cued in on, so I was just in Charleston, as you know. So Charleston is a tourist destination in the United States. Okay. So cite beautiful places in Charleston with photographs. Right. If I'm going to try to advocate for something, I would hate to use words without photographs of places that people can respond
to. But why are we having this podcast though? You know what I mean? Why do people write books? Like if you're not trying to get a message out and for me, it's not just collectively communicating something, because it takes a conversation that other people need to be involved with, because it's not like I have all the answers. It's not like you have all the answers. Now we're in this world, but I feel like it takes conversation to actually get to the right idea. And that right idea is not going to be the same everywhere by any means. It could change, that right idea is going to be different for Oklahoma City and different for Atlanta and different. And then within Oklahoma City, there's a million other differences between what is right for a certain area or not. And so I think it takes a common language actually to be able to have to make progress on a vision, because I think, yes, I completely agree that it takes showing people. Like, I say that quite a bit in terms of, that's why it's funny that I'm arguing with you on this, but like I always say, just show them a compelling alternative. You have to show them a compelling alternative, or they'll never really get on board. The people that are against it, right? But there's a lot of people that are kind of like, they just don't know about it, that are absolutely winnable with words and ideas. Like, I get people all the time going, oh my gosh, I never thought of it like that. That's really interesting. And that's actually the majority. I would say more people are like that than the ones that are just like, so, but want them to become.
Yeah. I would say one of the things that's most exciting to me about the concept of inner block development, or the most exciting thing is it is a frontier in which the small developer will have the upper hand.
Yep.
And the homeowner will have the upper hand. When I say small developer, I just mean any individual who wants to shape the world around them.
Yeah.
And I
not
think
institutional investors.
These conversations are really valuable. The conversations, about human flourishing and the built environment, and all that, and they need to be had, and yeah, they're very important. But I think also getting out there and starting to shape, and having many hands able to shape the world around them, and that was to me the most exciting thing about ADUs. Similarly, that's in some sense the heart of inner block development, is opening up our cities and our land to the individual, to the small developer, to the person being able to make a lot of small decisions about shaping the world as their home.
Which is interesting, because that's actually 100% a scale issue that we're talking about too. Like, in some ways, we're talking about scale in buildings, but here's like the scale of the individual versus the scale of an institution. And
That's right.
I still remember reading Jane Jacobs, who's a very famous author from I don't know when she wrote that book in the 70s, political activist and stuff, and very famous urbanism book. And one of them, I just remember the words. She was just talking about cataclysmic capital. Where too much money is actually not a good thing. Like, obviously you don't want not money, because then you can't do anything, but too much money can create huge problems. And by the way, if you look at Houston or Dallas or something like that, which by the way I'm from, and I feel totally fine criticizing, there's too many people moving there, too much money coming in. It's just like, wow, and but I love, and I agree with you, this inner block and the stuff that we're most interested in is, the institutional investors. This is what's crazy, that most people don't know. Like, so much of what gets built today, if you're a middle income earner or higher, you're probably putting some money into some fund somewhere, whether you're buying a real estate investment trust, and from the stock market, or you've got someone investing on your behalf, or you're doing some private placement investing. A lot of that money, though, ends up with, I'm going to use a bigger example that everyone would know, but, like a Bridgewater, or, BlackRock or something like that. Like, money gets funneled in those. And then those institutions, what their job is to invest your money and make the most amount of return humanly possible. When the scale gets that big and all the money gets funded into one centralized place, and then that centralized place is deploying that capital, like, capital is powerful. Like, capital is energy. Capital is doing things. And all that capital gets deployed from a centralized place to maximize returns. Of course, you're not going to get human flourishing on the other end.
That's right. That's right.
They do not care about Oklahoma City. They're going to be scouring data on it could be a podunk town, it could be the New York City. It doesn't matter. Where do the numbers that we think we can make the most money? Where can we put that apartment complex and extract the most profit from that community? They might never have been there. They don't care about it. It is a line item on a spreadsheet, and that's how our decisions are made. And that is a scale issue. Like, things start breaking at scale, whether it's suburbia or capital. And I think capital is really broken, and it's overly centralized. And I love, part of the reason I love, talking to you and these ideas too, is, how do you kind of break that up some and empower individuals? Because that's how culture is made. Big institutions don't make culture. Individuals and people and businesses and neighbors and community, that makes culture.
That's right. And it's so empowering. I think when you go to your favorite town, city in Europe or the United States downtown, and realize that, we're working in Edmond, Oklahoma, right?
Yep.
That, I talked about the city of Rome in comparison to my town. Well, okay, the city of Rome fits into like a tiny little corner of Edmond. And so in a lot of ways, like that scale that we're working with in the United States. And so if you're a new urbanist or want to be new urbanist or want to be small developer, and you're thinking about like you're building up your Monty Anderson or John Anderson farm, and if your farm is the scale of Oklahoma City, you're taking on your shoulders the issues that are so out of scale with at least traditional settlement types and patterns. Like, get smaller.
Yeah.
Smaller is where you can start to have an impact on the world around you. I like to think about, like, with new urbanists and like the inner block, like what's like the flower pot test. Very often, like, you get these like renderings or like plan drawings from like new urbanists and like greenfield development, and these buildings and the streets are still at a scale in which you would have to put so many flower pots out to make a difference.
Yeah.
I was just in Charleston, as we were talking about, walking around the traditional, they sometimes called alleys, but really not developed as service alleys, but but really as these secondary smaller streets. And there you'll walk down, and a beautiful pot of plants makes a huge difference, right? Like, build it a place at a scale, or have some streets or squares, whatever, where when you put the plant out there, it makes a difference it makes a difference, right? Like, how many pots of plants do you have to put on your front porch right now, Austin, to make a difference on your street? You can't.
Yeah.
Right? Because how far is it from building face to building face? And then, like,
Right.
how far are you from the sidewalk and everything else? And there are some lovely aspects to that. But I think that when it comes to um, places where you see yourself reflected and building culture, we also need to have these smaller grained places, the smaller fabric, where honestly the children and the elderly feel more at home, more reflected, and where your capital and your investment, your time investment, let's say, into doing something is so much, you could do so much more with so much less. If you're going to pave, something in brick and it's 18 foot wide, or your like little stoop, or like that little sequence, like I'm thinking of like all these places in Philadelphia or Charleston, it's actually not that much brick. If you want to like upgrade your driveway,
gosh, or just our streets in front of in our neighborhood, it would be millions of dollars.
And that's the urban 3 argument too, in part. Like, we've built an infrastructure which we can't afford.
Yeah, that one is
definitely
so
the
important.
Individual can't afford, right? We built an infrastructure that probably requires that BlackRock. It requires big capital to address, and you've sidelined intentionally, or
it requires debt and growth, and it's really extracted because certain people are making profits out of it, and that might even be the homeowner owning it for the time, right? And I'm not like saying people shouldn't make money off their houses. Of course, I want to make money off my house, but when it's leaving everything else worse off in the future, that's when I become like not okay with it. And especially now, having kids, where you really start thinking about that, like, what world are my kids going to grow up in? And going, okay, if we can't even afford, like, it doesn't matter if people like it in some ways if we can't afford it. That there's kind of a simplicity there to me. That makes sense in my little CPA brain. Like, the numbers have got to work, or you can't. It doesn't make sense. It's not sustainable. It's not resilient, and it's not because I think we're gonna have the next century is going to be terrible and no growth whatsoever or something like that. But not that I can predict anything, but I mean, it does seem like there will be less growth than we've seen for the past 100. I mean, the past 100 years is a blip in the eye of human history of how much innovation and money has been created. And it is absolutely remarkable in so many ways. Now, of course, when innovation and things are happening that quickly, you also get a lot of things wrong, which I think we have, but we've also gotten a lot of things right. I mean, we've done some really amazing things as just a society and a culture. But I think what we're going to have to continue with, because we're so used to this high growth, high money, you can waste money, is kind of the thing. When actually I was just reading this, it might have been it wasn't a Steve Jobs thing, but I'm listening to this podcast that I really like called Founders, by the way. And talks about, well, it was a different book, but they were talking about like the most dangerous time in a company is as soon as they achieve extreme success. Like that's when most companies end up failing because they actually have too many resources. Like if you're not really careful and self-disciplined and all that, they'll actually destroy themselves over time. And I just kind of think about like that's what the American society has been like. We've just been bloated with wealth for not all individuals, right? Like I understand there are a lot of poor people in America, but I mean just as a society and institutions bloated with wealth, and it hasn't led to great decisions, and things are about to get more tight, I would say, where we have to actually make decisions based off numbers, not assuming that we can just have infinite amounts of debt. So if suburban sprawl subdivisions, the numbers don't pencil, they don't pencil, and I think we have to talk about that.
Hey, can I talk? So while you're, I think one thing that goes well with what you just said is couple different conversations that happened during this ION conference.
I'd love to hear.
In Charleston. And one of them is, so ION is, it's being lauded as one of the best new urbanist developments. I want to say maybe 25 years ago by Vince and Jeff Graham and their dad. And it's in Mount Pleasant. So it's just across the inlet from downtown Charleston. Okay. So I was staying in downtown and it took us 10 minutes via car, whatever, to get there. And one of the things that Vince said is he said, so that was kind of, if you think about that time frame, like maybe it was even longer ago than that. Whatever, it was really early on in the kind of new urbanist kind of greenfield neighborhood. I mean, this is essentially a greenfield development. I think it was one of the early DPZ things. And he said you couldn't do this today. And so the question, from Aaron Lubeck is like, okay, so are you saying that despite all the work of the Congress for New Urbanism, whatever else, it's getting harder to do good new urbanist projects? And I think Vince and the general conversation in the room was, yes, it is harder to do new urbanist projects. And probably the biggest reason, a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is finance. So the way projects get financed today is different than the way real estate gets financed today is different than it was even just say 10 years ago. And so without even looking at our current interest rates, a boutique, real estate or development firm like the Grahams doing this beautiful development of ION found a way to get it done however many years, 30 years ago, whatever it was. And they're saying today we couldn't do that. There are other things now, like the stormwater and everything else. But so then there was a group of us younger people there. And so Aaron is saying, okay, so what are we saying to these younger people? And there wasn't really much going on after that. Obviously my whole thing is I'm not really interested in greenfield right now anyway. I don't know any young people that are interested in greenfield. And it's not that they couldn't be interested. I mean, I was when I first went to grad school. It's that we just recognize that intuitively, and we're aware of the fact we have to get smaller, we have to get leaner, and infill is where that opportunity is. And there are other reasons why I care more about infill. Okay, so that happened. I think that's interesting. Later on, I think the second day we got a tour of Catfiddle, and Reed Burgess, I'm probably butchering his last name. He is, I think, the main developer on Catfiddle. You know the pictures of Catfiddle Street. Other people.
I've just messaged him a couple times. We don't know each other, but we've messaged on Instagram or something. Because I was salivating over what he was. I was very impressed. I couldn't believe it was new construction in the United States.
He's the OG of Inner Block, right?
Man.
They were one of the first groups to embrace building at this tight human scale on essentially throwaway land. Put together a group of 2 or 3 lots. I can't remember how small it is, but it's not even, it wouldn't even measure on any developer's framework, of land. It's like a quarter acre or something like that they have to build on. So we're over there getting a tour of this, and I think they started in 2015. It's maybe 20 homes or 21 homes. Each one has its own ADU. It's on land that was maybe by right, they could have gotten 3 homes on, and it's just throwaway land that only an incremental developer could love. But it's such a vision, the contrast between this, Vince Graham saying, hey, we can't build ION anymore. And people in the room just saying like, oh, CNU hasn't made it anywhere. And I think, yeah, you're right. You can't play at this greenfield in the way that you kind of could it 30 years ago. But it's really a beautiful example of what you can do and what's by acre a bit more successful. And I wouldn't be surprised if just from an investment point of view, actually, you're getting more out of it is Capitol Street. And Vince said, if I were to do it, and Vince is working on Capitol, and he said, now that's the only kind of project that I'm interested in building. It's these tight urban projects using land very efficiently, densely, but building at a human scale. And so it's just an interesting. So
it's cool. Well, and to follow up on that, you're talking about Capitol Street, which, this is a small. How big is it, Tom? Like, do you know? Like, but you said it's an acre.
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's not big. We'll put it that way. I think
it's 0.9 acres or something like that.
Right. Okay. So, our development that we are working on, called the Townsend, that's going to be in Edmond, Oklahoma, downtown Edmond, Oklahoma, that we'll be starting construction on next year. It'll be about 20 something townhouses and 20,000 square feet of commercial. But what's been really cool, and this is the first time I'm doing this, but I've got a partner on this, a business partner, Matthew Myers, who's co-developing this with me. And he's really the mentor. Like he's kind of the gray hair. I mean, he's 50s, but he's got experience, doing this and raising money and stuff. But he's really brought me on to not just do the design and construction, as building culture, but me personally as helping me become a developer, which we've already dabbled in that, right? We pulled off the bend and crawled the landing and some other small project, but this is a $25-30 million project. This is serious. And so it's great to have that maturity there and experience. But my point is, as I'm in these investor meetings and I'm reaching out to people and trying to raise money, can I have $100,000? Can I have $100,000? We're trying to raise $3 million for this thing. And what's been really cool is everyone invested in it is local. Everyone invested in it is someone that is interested in the community, almost even like not just that sounds like a good deal, I'll do it. And granted, there's probably going to be a few of those in there, and that's okay. But everyone in there right now, and we've raised 1.6 million, is like, man, this is cool. I grew up here. I want to see this happen. Or wow, I never even thought this could happen in downtown Edmond. I can't believe what's happening here. Or they're just like, yeah, this is a really neat project. I'd love to like kind of be a part of it. And I mean, think about how different that is than some centrally controlled capital somewhere deploying it. These are local people who care about their communities that are putting money into a deal so that we can go build a deal and make their communities better. And by the way, make money. And that's a lot more fun than putting in the stock market or, giving it to BlackRock or something. I mean, there's a lot of power there at the small scale because too, at $25-30 million project, we can raise money off of that too. Like as individuals, I'm not a full-time syndicator. I'm not going out, professionally just managing people's money, but I can raise $3 million, locally, especially if we, it'll get easier over time in a lot of ways too. And that's so cool.
Sitting at a table during one of these sessions with it was Kobe, who's I can't remember his last name.
Twitter famous, yeah.
Twitter guy. What is his last name? Whatever. And then Bo was on the other side, Bo Wright from Strong Towns. And most of the conversation had to do with capital and had to do with small developers like us, with the backdrop being this bigger conversation that you can't build Ion today, but in the back of our minds, we're all thinking about capital.
Yeah, we're not trying to build.
One of the things that we were talking about is that the need for a developer's fund to get over some of those initial hurdles of acquisition, all that. Like there's so many things that are stacked against good development.
So many things.
But to the point you just made, you like one of the reasons you can't build Ion now is because of the way that capital works today and is different, right? Like private equity and all that. But really what is part of like the culture project is called like pushing back on this, I think, is aligned capital. And in some sense, like I leaned over and I was like, don't you dare get capital that's not aligned. Like, have the return be lower. Make sure that it's aligned capital before you accept it. Like, just like plant your flag on that, because in large part, it's like getting in bed with this oversized stuff, right? Like we talked, like the capital is what drives all these projects. Like that's, the form of suburbia or whatever. Like I don't even engage. Like, yeah, okay, that's the form of a spreadsheet and and capital that's not present. So what is capital being present look like in people that are actually interested in human scaled turning the tide? I think, Leon Creer has this book, Choice or Fate. And I remember at one point he talks about, like, in the United States, like, we did more damage post World War II than we could, than Dresden. And that's
right.
That's not quite true, but we did bulldoze our downtowns, and I think we have this moment of people recognizing, among other things, the inner block as this new opportunity. You haven't been able to build inside of there for over 100 years now. We haven't built at a human scale in the United States, except for like the occasional Acorn Street or the Charleston Lanes or Philadelphia. And people like Reed and Cat Fiddle and Kenny Kraft, like the amazing stuff that Kenny is doing, is really kind of opening up our eyes at the same time that capital is pushing us in that direction. We can't do an ion anymore. Like, let's recognize that, and let's see the opportunities for whole lifetime's worth of work within spitting distance. Like, you could spend as a small incremental developer, you could make your whole career out of a few neighboring blocks working.
Absolutely.
Inside. Yeah.
I mean, there's a development, which I'm not going to say what it is, but that we've worked on together that's pretty large. I mean, that could be a 30-year project.
Yeah. And presumably, yeah, right. And I would say, hopefully, it would be setting the stage for incrementally growing.
That's what I mean by that's what I mean by 30-year project, because it stuff like that needs to be incremental, and it's actually pretty small. Like, it seems big to us, but because it's infill, but it's small. It's tiny though in terms of what usually people are dealing with for a subdivision, or not tiny per se, but I mean,
relatively,
yeah. I think the other cool thing about which I'm just kind of thinking about this for the first time, but if you go off and get money and go build a subdivision, like, the people that live in that subdivision, you could say, even though we don't whatever, they get to experience it and maybe they really love it, okay, and they get to have that, but like, it's not really for the city, like, it doesn't it's not additive as a public realm, as a place to share. And I don't mean everything is shared, like at home, like you don't own your home. That's not what I'm saying. Gosh, there's so many times people are like, I've been repeated to, because I'll say something that sounds like new urbanism, and they'll be like, oh, you'll own nothing and love it, repeating the World Economic Forum line or something. And I'm like, God, that is not what I mean. Like, if you hear anything we're talking about, we're actually talking about bringing the scale down and stopping, trying to, anyway. But the infill stuff, like, for example, this Townsend development in downtown Edmond, there's people excited about it that are not going to live there. Like, they're literally never going to live there, probably, because they want a little more space, or because it's too high price point, or not enough bedrooms, whatever it is. But they're like, oh, I just can't wait to see this in Edmond. It's going to be so cool. Like, I mean, that's unique when I'm realizing, like, you don't see people getting excited about some subdivision going in unless they're planning on living there.
Okay, so let's pause there for a second, because I think that that's so important, and I think that also allows us to distinguish streets from spaces, because in the United States, we, back in, like, so I'm not going to get on this because it's going to take too long and we're going to talk for a while. But essentially, all of the property lines that we have are a reflection of effectively, efficiently, essentially, cutting up land west of the Ohio River and selling it off, right?
Yep.
And so part of that is platting cities, but city streets are not platted so as to be spaces, and definitely suburban sprawl is not trying to create public space, public realm, places where people belong, right? Well, Townsend is building public space, even though that's going to be privately held, land inside the block. It's semi-public, semi-private, and anybody who walks past that is going to feel themselves reflected by that, and they're going to feel it's an invitation.
Oh, that's such a good way to put it.
Yeah, privately owned, it is an invitation to every single person who walks past to walk through, to look in, to see these spaces that reflect the person. Real spaces, right? Like when you're in Spain and it's like, this is a street. Well, when you have a street in the United States, it's apples and oranges. Like that, from a terminology point of view, we need to start using other words, because what you're building in with streets and courtyards and little squares in Townsend is not the same thing as the streets around the perimeter of that block. And I do think that anybody who sees that and experiences that will get that in a second, right? Like there's no kind of, language can fall. I mean, not to downgrade, like it's important language is important, it's important to choose this wisely, but people will get that immediately as they see it.
Yeah, boy, I cannot wait to get going on this. You'll have to come down. We actually are submitting our site plan today or tomorrow.
Congratulations. Nice.
Yeah, we need to jump back on some architecture and stuff. So we need to get together on that. But we're a little over, we're right at an hour. So let's wrap up here, and we'll just schedule again to chat about other things. So
that's good.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Tom.
Yep.
And for all y'all listening, if please like and subscribe and share if you had anything that was helpful for you. And see you guys next time.